All right, so now I'll be talking about the small sketchbook. This book is only 3 inches tall and 5 inches wide, and yet it was somewhat of my most trusted companion while I was traveling, because pretty much every drawing in here was done within a 90-minute period. So they're much more like sketches than they are developed drawings or paintings like we saw in the previous book. All right, so let's jump right in with Galway. I did this first drawing while waiting for the bus that would take me to the Cliffs of Moher. I liked how busy this narrow cobblestone street was and how many tourists were photographing the old stone buildings. This next drawing was also done while waiting for transport. I liked how little respect people had for this old stone relic, as it had been vandalized and boarded up in some areas. Here's a detail from Dun Aengus, the ancient Celtic fort that I mentioned earlier. I had a lot of fun capturing the intricacies of the dry stone construction with my fountain dip pen. This full spread drawing was done while my relative was making dinner. So while that was happening, I went out into their backyard, found an old ruin of a chapel, and finished the drawing before dinner was ready, while also managing to include their house in the background in the top right corner. The following day on Inishmore, I did a lot of exploration, which took me to the barren landscape on the opposite side of the island, where the so-called Black Fort was located. I really loved how the short stone walls flowed naturally into the walls of the fort, which you can see in the top left corner of this drawing. Speaking of which, this beehive hut, which in Celtic is called a clochan, seems to be a home that flows out of the stone dividing walls around it. Despite being built 1,800 years ago, it has a 10-foot apex point and seemed very sturdy for a building that was made purely out of the rocks and grass that are surrounding it. While walking along the cliffs of Inishmore and the Cliffs of Moher, I noticed how rectilinear the natural rock formations were, which must have been a large contributing factor to the dominance of dry stone construction in the region. After the fact, when looking at the plan view of the fort, I also noticed how the walls of the fort, as well as the short dividing walls all over the island, seemed to mirror the natural topography of the area, a relationship that proves how responsive this ancient construction was to the landscape. Once back in Galway, I had fun drawing more commercial cobblestone streets in the city center. I loved how the locals barely acknowledged how their city was made almost entirely out of stone and cobblestone. Another thing that the locals seemed nonchalant about were the ruins of ships in the harbor. While doing this drawing, a local boater came up to me to talk. I asked him what all these ruined boats were doing here, and he replied with, "I don't know, nobody's even tried to remove them," which I thought was very different, at least from my experience living in a harbor town in the US. This next full spread drawing is from the Abbey in Ballinasmalla. As I mentioned before, the rocks of this ruin had softer edges, which negatively impacts the structural integrity of the building. This may be why this abbey was so low to the ground and only featured 1 to 2 story buildings. In the town of Claremorris, there was also a lot of cool old stone buildings that had been repurposed. On the left is a drawing of the interior of an old Protestant church that was turned into a public library, and on the right is a stone townhouse that was converted into a clothing store. After crossing Ireland to the east coast, I did my first drawing in the coastal town of Malahide, where I was staying, which was about a 20-minute train ride from Dublin city centre. This massive ruin was also an abbey, and yet it looks nothing like the one in Ballinasmalla. When comparing Western Irish architecture to Eastern architecture, it's clear that the East was much more influenced by British styles, as well as using tighter stone masonry. While waiting for the train in Dublin, I sketched the old stone foundation of the elevated train line that ran through the city as it stood out from its modern surroundings of glass. While on the village peninsula of Howth, I loved how the entire town was in the shadow of a large cathedral ruin, which was situated atop the hill. It almost seemed like a center point from which the village radiated from. I spent multiple days in Dublin's urban centre just doing quick sketches like these of street scenes that I found interesting. For each drawing, I tried to keep a certain architectural scheme in focus, such as the intricate stone ornamentation of the building facades, or the integration of old stone structures with the new. When I visited Dublin Castle, I was pleasantly surprised to see that it was under renovation. I thought it was a very compelling image to have a historical, grandiose stone castle with a giant crane operating on it. This drawing on the right was from the courtyard of Antrim Castle Gardens in Northern Ireland, which had been repurposed into a cafe space. Soon after my time in Belfast, I moved up to Ballycastle, from where I explored the Causeway coast. I was astonished by the black basalt igneous rock that littered the coastline and how certain structures, like this visitor's pier on the left, responded to its presence. Even more shocking was the incredible natural rock formations that I came across while walking along the coastline, like this double-arched limestone phenomenon called the sea arch by locals. This full spread drawing depicts Dunluce Castle, which I mentioned briefly in the previous sketchbook. Because of its size and durability, this castle is one of the most famous in Ireland and is a perfect example of stone protective architecture that uses the dramatic coastal landscape to its advantage. While exploring this coastline, there was also some quieter moments that I appreciated, like this stone-walled harbor in Ballintoy on the left, or the skeletons of limestone cottages nestled into the limestone cliffs, which is in this drawing on the right. One day later, after sailing out of Ballycastle and making port in Scotland, I made it to Edinburgh, one of the region's most well-known picturesque cities. I could talk about the streetscapes of Edinburgh endlessly, but for the sake of time, I'll just focus on the content of the drawings. So this full spread image is from the city's Royal Mile and shows just how swarmed the most famous street in the city was. The drawing on the left illustrates how the streets of Edinburgh respond to the topography, with winding, steeply sloped cobblestone roads, where the rooftops are offset in a step-like pattern. Perhaps the best example of landscape responsive architecture is Edinburgh Castle, whose plan is directly informed by the jagged cliff tops it sits upon. Edinburgh is a city made entirely out of sandstone, and even modern buildings follow suit. For example, the National Museum of Scotland, shown left, features modern massing in an almost brutalist design, and yet is made from fine-cut ashlar. Even the city's incredible infrastructure is all stone, like the many arched bridges that allow for major commercial streets to pass over others. Just like when I noticed in Ireland, the locals seem to have very little reverence for the architectural wonderment of the city, as they see these buildings every day. It makes perfect sense. In the square after dark, I watched people smash beer bottles, skateboard on the old masonry, and even stamp cigarettes out all over the place. Additionally, before I left the city, I made sure to do a few quick sketches of closes, which is the Scottish term for alleyways, that oftentimes connected streets of varying heights with long, steep stairways. While I was constantly swarmed by crowds trying to see my drawings in Edinburgh, Aberdeen couldn't have been more different. As I walked through the streets of that city, I barely saw a single tourist. In fact, while I drew in the city's central square, the only other people that were there were two homeless men that sat beside me on the big iron letters spelling out Aberdeen. Despite being in the northwest corner of Scotland, however, Aberdeen did share some strange architectural similarities to Ireland, like the Foot D Bridge in Ballider, which closely resembled a bridge in Antrim, or this rock formation on the right, which looked a lot like the sea arch that I drew in Northern Ireland. One neighborhood of Aberdeen that was lively, however, was the historic district of Footy, where residents casually lived in well-renovated ancient stone buildings that featured stone slate roofing as well. I drew this left drawing the morning that I left Aberdeen, just so that I could remember the unique quality of the granite city's desaturated monochrome that I found oddly beautiful. Later that day, I landed in Inverness, where I was immediately drawn to the juxtaposition between old buildings like Inverness Castle and new glass buildings like Bridge Street Apartments, which are literally adjacent to the ancient castle. On a day trip from Inverness, I visited Conan Bridge, an ancient stone arch bridge that became overgrown and eroded. While the old bridge remained, a new steel footbridge ran alongside it, which also had water pipes and electrical lines from the surrounding village attached to its sides. So at this point in the trip, I ran out of room in that little book, so I ended up getting a new one for the last few days of my travel. I filled up the first few pages with scenes from Inverness's Cultural Centre, which features a wide variety of stone types. Some buildings were made from locally sourced sandstone, others with granite from Aberdeen, and some used stone that came all the way from India. I also showed in these urban drawings the amount of construction that was happening in the city. As mentioned before, Inverness is growing rapidly, and it shows. Construction workers were hard at work all over the place, working on new projects or even renovating an older stone structure. Once I got to Bath, it was much more of the Edinburgh problem, constant crowds and constant distractions. However, during my few days of street sketching in the city, I was able to find some quiet areas where I could be more productive. Particularly, I did multiple drawings highlighting the different kind of Roman columns in the city, and more importantly, the treatment of those columns. People piled their trash bags beside them. Some were used as ornament for modern shop fronts. At one point, I even saw a porch with massive Ionian columns, which was being used as a tag sale. There was also graffiti covering so much of these ancient Roman structures, which I found very appealing in its irony. I like how casually locals treated these stones laced with history, and added their own identity to it as well. This drawing is from the quarry in Inverness, so sorry for the disorder there. But on my last day in Bath, I visited the Circus, which is a set of row houses that are laid out in a perfect circle at a roundabout. It was an incredible sight to see how seamlessly these Romanesque stone apartments flowed perfectly along the circular curve. However, it was especially hard to draw in perspective, though. All right, and that about does it for the small sketchbooks. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much.